Anybody has any questions?
For Dr. Reena, that between the last set, Malukin ring and
the Oasis.
which one do you prefer and why?
Actually, Malukin I'm using for the last almost 2.5 years, and Oasis is relatively new. I've just started using it in the last 5 months, and in fact I'm liking Oasis better. So I like it better because it's very pliable, and in the eye, sometimes in Malukin ring I felt the challenge, but when you're releasing it, sometimes it causes a little iris trauma and bleeding and all, and if it's a large ring, and once you snap the angle, it goes back and hits the anterior chamber angle sometimes, which is very large. So I'm finding that the Oasis ring, which I've only used now, about 9 of them, I find them far more easily used within the eye. So
I thought this works damages the angle than the Malukin.
It doesn't, because it's a square thing, and even when you're launching it in the eye, the stress in the eye is far lesser.
Cost-wise, they are saying.
Sorry? Cost-wise, Oasis right now, when we got it was more like a sample to us. They haven't launched it, but I think the cost is pretty similar.
Marketed by?
We are getting it from Chhatrapur, our distributor, but Oasis is an independent firm which launched it, I think, just about 6 to 8 months ago. I think in the last year, it was about a year ago, and now they are marketing through distributors. But we got actually a pack of few, and we were just playing with them, and now maybe we'll start using it. And in fact, I'm liking it a little more than the Malukin.
What's the cost of that?
See, Malukin turns out to be about 6,000 rupees to the patient. To the organization.
Sheila, can you use the mic, please, because everybody can't hear her.
Sorry. I'm saying the Malukin costs the patient about 6,000 rupees, but to the organization, I think it's a little less, 4,000 or 3,000. I might be wrong. I am not sure. Maybe they have started making some, but we primarily use these.
So initially so expensive and now they've come up and showed it.
Yeah, initially actually because I am from an organization which does a lot of charitable work, so we were even ETOing them for our charitable wing. But the catch is sometimes if you haven't washed them enough before you load it back into the cartridge, if there's any viscoelastic remaining on them, it tends to fix these rings in the cartridge and you can't take them out the second time. But if you're very meticulous in washing them well and then putting it back into that triangular, the plastic case and then ETO it, it works well for almost 3-4 uses. We've done it for our charitable wing. Not something that I mean to say advocate otherwise routinely, but in patients where you want to give them the benefit without charging them, you might waste 2, but you'll be able to use the third one on them. But it works well. Actually, it looks scary once you start using them. You find them far more, what shall I say, you wouldn't touch hooks thereafter. You wouldn't want to touch hooks thereafter. I will put it back.
Thank you, Dr. Reena. I would like to thank Dr. Madhu Baduria for asking me to summarize the course. I think all the aspects of combined glaucoma and cataract surgery have been well covered. I think I would like to add a few things. One is that whenever you do a combined surgery, whether it's a single-site phaco or a two-site phaco, it's important to remember that normally when you do a simple trabeculectomy, we can do some things in the post-operative period like digital massage, all that. That can be a little dicey if you do a combined procedure, because when you do a digital massage in a patient who has had an IOL and trab, what happens, there is the risk of hyphema and the risk of showering in the chamber can occur. So that must be kept in mind. That's why if you want to get a really good intraocular pressure control, maybe doing a trab alone or IOL alone, and doing trab either before or after surgery, IOL is probably a better idea. Because now with the advent of temporal clear corner phaco, the eye is almost like a normal phakic eye. So doing a second stage trabeculectomy also not be a bad idea, because the virgin penuncula is open and the surgical success rate is as good as a primary trabeculectomy. The other thing you should keep in mind is that with the awareness that a lot of our patients have narrow angle glaucoma, doing a combined surgery can have all the complications which you see with the primary angle closure glaucoma trabeculectomy, like a malignant glaucoma. So there is a IOL alone, maybe the risk of malignant glaucoma is probably less. So that should be kept in mind whenever you do plan a surgery. So supposing if you have a doubt, do a cataract surgery alone and do a trabeculectomy or control medically the intraocular pressure. But in case the patient has got very severe glaucoma where the pressure is like 30 or 40 with multiple drugs, doing a combined surgery may not be a good idea because the combined surgery doesn't control the pressure as well as a simple trabectomy. Maybe controlling the pressure with trabectomy and do a temporal corneal phaco may be a good idea. I think there were some points which are mentioned on how to raise a flap where you get a uniform bed of the scleral flap, because the key to having a good trabeculectomy is to have a very good flap of the trabeculectomy. So one of the tips I would like to share with you is to use a 500 micron blade, which is a preset depth. If you make the marking with the blade, you get a uniform depth of flap, because otherwise what happens, with the number of traps being less, people find it difficult, especially the residents find it difficult to raise a flap. So sometimes the flap is too thin or it's too thick and they enter the antechamber too early. So one of the ways to avoid is to mark the flap with the 500 micron blade, because it's a preset depth is there, so that you get a uniform depth of the flap. I think regarding the pupil dilation has been very well covered using the hooks and all those new gadgets to expand the pupil. I've made the life much easier. And Dr. Madhu has mentioned about a combined armored valve and phaco. As he mentioned that those are reserved for patients with severe glaucoma, like where there is PAS or neovascular glaucoma. Maybe doing a trap may not be a good idea. Doing an armored valve would be a good idea. I think that's all I want to say, and I'd like to hand over to Dr. Madhu.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, audience. I think Dr. Dogra is already waiting for, not for this now. Yeah. The next 4 people are here. If they're here, please be vacated and we'll be outside. The next 4 people are there. We can take the questions if nobody is here. We can stay here only. We need the stage. We are here in the hall, and we take the questions right here. We are here for any questions. Anyone have very personal? Actually, we will take both the and that on the table. Try to release it. If it is releasing on the table, we release afterwards also. If it is not releasing, we use the number of clothes. Yes, at times with 4 to none doesn't release. In that also there's sometimes phenol stuck in that. You must make sure that there is no phenol in that tissue. If there is any phenol in that. I don't think so. अब आएगा कहाँ? कौन देगा?
Morning, ma'am. Congratulations.
So actually, Kanpur University decided themselves, but they wanted the names. So your name was there. This is the friend that I had. I put all the names. From next year, we'll be with Lucknow University. Then it will be probably better managed. Kanpur is totally. This is my first year in taking all this responsibility.
Sir, you got the award for excellence in healthcare.
Thank you, sir. The same Thank you, sir. The hospital got it, sir.
हमारे लिए तो आप
He's changed the place and transformed
Used to put a suture in, so this compresses when the suture is compressed, it opens the Schlem's canal. Eye stent is reasonably promising. It's being used a lot these days. There are 2 stents for 2 right and left sides, and they connect anterior chamber to the Schlem's canal directly. They're cutting nothing over there, and evidence is now pouring down that definitely if you do an eye stent or cataract alone, eye stent is giving definitely lower pressures, but it's not that the patient really goes off. So this does give certain amount, but not like trabeculectomy. This has been in use for a long time, but somehow not gained popularity because the machine by itself, you need to have a separate machine for this. CyPass is reasonably investigational. This is connecting anterior chamber to the suprachoroidal space, like our cytodialysis of older days. Hydrus is another implant like that. And so we come to then why do we need these devices and who will be benefited. These devices will be extremely useful for all the patients who would not be suitable for medications or those patients who will require smaller drops. As we have seen that whether we do a trabeculectomy or we do a valve, we are connecting our anterior chamber to the environment outside, and we all know that these patients are more susceptible to trauma as well as infections. So if you have to really have a hold on them, especially the patients suppose we require pressure comes over 24, 26 after cataract surgery, if we could have it about 16, 15. These are the patients who will be benefited by these things. So in future, what are we likely to be doing probably? That we will be probably doing more combined surgeries because they would not be adding any more risk over number of cataract surgeries. However, these would be suitable for smaller drop patients. All the patients who will require a larger drop, we will again have to resort only to trabeculectomy and TDDs. Minimally invasive devices will compete with medicines. So probably there will be an industry war on by these devices and the medicines because those will be marketed aggressively. So with these few words, I'll say thank you to all and thank you for a very patient hearing. And now, as we all know that we're living in a country of angle closure, we are living in a country which cannot really afford phacos in every patient. So now I have Dr. Jyoti from Chikapraya Hospital. She would talk to us about trabeculectomy with SICS and all those patients who require SICS following the trabeculectomy. Dr. Jyoti.
Good morning, everyone. Manual small incision cataract surgery with trabeculectomy. So by now we know that this is a patient who is in need of a combined cataract and glaucoma surgery because he has a visually significant cataract, has advanced high-risk progressive glaucoma. He is at least on 2 medications and cannot tolerate a post-op IT spike. He is probably intolerant to medication side effects or has probably poor compliance. And a second surgery would be difficult for him for so many reasons. So we also know that a combined surgery is not as effective as standalone, is technically more complex and has more chances of per and post-operative complications. Still, the advantages are that as compared to a cataract surgery alone, a combined with a better immediate and long-term IOP control, it has the advantage of a single operation, which can prevent an IOP spike that could complicate a cataract surgery alone and has definite socio-economic benefits. So now once we've decided to go in for a combined surgery, we have 2 options, either going for a phaco trap or an SICS trap. Phaco trap has a smaller clay corneal incision advantage, leading to less tissue handling, bleeding, less blood active barrier disruption, AC reaction, and probably less chances of post-op fibrosis and more chances of blood success. In an SICS trap, the incision is larger, is made on the highly vascularized tissue that is sclera, and hence this leads to more tissue handling and bleeding, more blood active barrier disruption and AC reaction, and probability of more chances of post-op fibrosis and probably less chances of blood success. So then why and when to do a small incision, a manual small incision cataract surgery with trabeculectomy? There would be indications where a surgeon would be definitely more comfortable and more confident of giving better post-op results with SICS trap as compared to phaco trap. Now in patients where very shallow AC is there with already compromised endothelium or severe gutata or fugues with very hard cataracts, phaco manipulation is definitely going to further compromise an already compromised endothelium. And in long-standing phacomorphic glaucoma eyes with long-standing inflamed eyes with corneal edema or corneal haze, phaco manipulation again would be technically difficult because of poor visualization and also because of high intralentillar pressures in these eyes. Capsulorhexis would be very difficult and so phaco would be difficult in issue. Economic factors will be very much important in a country like ours where more than 50% of the population is still in dire need of a cost-effective surgery which has the potential of giving excellent post-operative results as well. And we can give that by doing meticulous and delicate handling of the tissue, avoiding crushing of forceps, burning with the cautery, as this leads to more tissue breakdown products, inciting more inflammation, taking care of the bleeders and avoiding subconjunctival hemorrhage and superior rectus hematoma as far as possible, as blood in the vicinity of the incision brings in fibroblasts, leading to more fibrosis, taking care of the hypema as blood in the anterior chamber is going to incite more reaction, leading to more fibrosis, and also using more of wound modulators as the previous people have said, and also aggressive per-operative anti-inflammatory coverage. Taking care of all these precautions, it is possible to get excellent results with SICS strap with good target IOP achievement. So now once you've decided to go in for an SICS strap, if a patient has a visually significant cataract whose IOP is well controlled, it is better to do just a temporal SICS leaving superior conjunctiva virgin for a future trap. In a patient with cataract whose IOP is not controlled, do a regular superior SICS trabeculectomy. Now in a patient whose main problem is an uncontrolled intraocular pressure but has a very mild cataract, we have two options. If a surgeon is not very comfortable with temporal SICS, or probably the case is of an angle closure glaucoma where it has been seen that the lens extraction itself would reduce the intraocular pressure further by 3 to 4 millimeter mercury, better on the side of taking a decision of superior SICS with trap. Or maybe if the main problem is definitely high intraocular pressures with multiple risk factors of blood failure, do a trap first and followed by temporal SICS later. At least keep difference between the interval between the two surgeries 6 months, preferably 1 year, as an interval less than this has been found to be associated with more blood failures. This is a case of acute angle closure glaucoma whose intraocular pressure was controlled pre-operatively by doing a YAG PI and giving pre-op medications. And so do a side port incision, gently decompression of the anterior chamber, make the anterior chamber, form the anterior chamber periscope, make conjunctival flaps, go subtenons, use non-traumatic tooth forceps with non-tooth forceps, go deep posteriorly, making deep pockets. Here is the stage where you can use mitomycin C. Do judge the bleeder and not of scleral tissue. Make triangular half thickness scleral flap incision and extend the incision on both the sides as curves to give stability to the corneal scleral tunnel. And taking the crescent, you make a regular superior SICS tunnel that you make. The only difference being that in the same sweeping motion you can include the scleral flap also. The advantage being that the scleral flap dissection is 100% made in a single dissection plane, which decreases the post-op fibrosis and leading to blood success. And also because it's a no-touch technique, you are not holding the flap with the forceps, so getting it damaged or disinserted is not there. There are other ways of making corneal scleral trap incisions, like making it straight, as shown in the next slide, and then followed by a regular trap and then giving two sutures tensor nylon at the sides of the sclerostomy opening, or making an M or what is known as the inverted W, again giving it with the lateral cups on the sides and holding the flap with the forceps, using the crescent to make half thickness scleral flap and then continuing it forward as a corneal scleral tunnel, followed by the regular incisions and steps of the SICS along with trap and giving one suture to the scleral flap finally. And coming back to the previous surgery, enter the anterior chamber with the keratome and try to do a good rhexis. A rhexis and an SICS would be larger. This is to ensure an in the back placement of the lens, again because this is a physiological position where the lens will not be in contact with the other intraocular tissues, which greatly minimizes the chances of anti-chamber reaction. And do a good hydroprolapse and viscoexpression of the nucleus, or you can use an irrigating rectus for the same. Wash out the cortex, put the lens in the bag, and then coming to the trap part. It is always better to use a Kelly sponge because it is more precise and less traumatic. Hold the flap with the forceps gently, don't pull it upwards, and enter the anterior chamber with the Kelly sponge till the internal lip of the incision. Make the Kelly sponge perpendicular to the tissue so that you make good perpendicular cuts, and make the sclerostomy opening up to the level of blue and white junction, and then do a good broad basal irectomy so that it doesn't close down the sclerostomy opening. The one thing which has to be taken care of at all points of time is to not to allow anterior chamber to flatten out at any point and keep it well formed with visco. Wash the anterior chamber and put one tensor nylon suture on the scleral flap. Bury the sutures as the exposed viscose of the sutures can incite more inflammation. And then coming to the conjunctival flap filtrings, I have done it with 8-0 Vicryl. Probably 10-0 Vicryl appears to be a better option. And here again you can give a worried knob by taking the bite first on the free end of the conjunctiva and then on the attached end of the conjunctiva along with the perilimbar tissue. I have not done that here. And similarly, make the winged suture on the other side of the incision, make it really watertight. The place that you can see just behind the suture is open. I have given another suture there, which is not shown in the video. And then making the winged suture on the other side, make a tight hood of the conjunctiva over the superior part of the cornea so as to make it tight, it doesn't leak from there. Finally form the antechamber and check for the formation of blood on table. This is another short video where a person has already gone superior trabeculectomy and has developed cataract and is to be taken up for temporal analysis. 3 points to be remembered here is not to take the surgery before 6 months, preferably 1 year, and give excellent per-operative anti-inflammatory coverage and try to not to touch the superior half of the conjunctiva. This can be done by taking the lateral rectal little suture and rotating the eyeball superiorly so that you are making the incision in the inferior temporal part. And this was the first post-op day picture of the case where a little antechamber inflammation is seen, but a good diffused blood is seen, and we could bring down the pre-operative pressure levels from 50 to 8 mm mercury post-operatively. The rest of the complications are same as seen in phaco trap or regular trap, the only difference being because of the incisional architecture and placement, we see more of hyphema and post-op inflammation. As a result, it is always better to omit the anticoagulant therapy at least one week before surgery in consultation with the treating physician and be more aggressive in the per-operative anti-inflammatory coverage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti, for a very nice presentation and lovely surgery. She opened the full chamber and did rhexis. She is very, very expert. She can do it. And my only request is that don't open the anterior chamber full. Just do rhexis and then open your anterior chamber. Dr. Jyoti can do rhexis anywhere in any situation of any size. But then that's not the really message should go to audience. So please do your rhexis before you open the anterior chamber and beautifully shown surgeries. Thank you, Jyoti. Now, Dr. Reena Manchanda Chaudhary is there. I get back this thing. She would be talking about the often faced problem of a glaucoma surgeon is those small pupils. So, how do we deal with all kinds of pupils? She will be talking about that.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to thank you for involving me in this instruction course. So I think we've heard a lot from the previous speakers about choosing what surgery to do when you're managing cataract and glaucoma, and I'll be talking about an added situation of having non-dilating pupil in pseudoexfoliation. We also know that pseudoexfoliation is basically a disorder characterized by accumulation of epithelial cellular material in the ocular tissues, and it's often associated with glaucoma. The diagnosis is primarily clinical. It's when you see the pseudoexfoliated material on the pupillary edge and undilated situation, or you dilate and see it on the anterior lens capsule, and if you do gonioscopy, you might find this material in the angle as well. The material is also present on the zonules, which you can't see clinically, but histologically and otherwise it's there. We also know that the prevalence of glaucoma in these eyes is significantly higher, and it tends to increase further with age. So the higher the age, the higher the chances of pseudoexfoliation. We also know that the prevalence of glaucoma in these eyes is higher. It's about 20 to 30% higher as compared to patients who do not have pseudoexfoliation. And also when you follow up these eyes which have only pseudoexfoliation, they have a tendency to develop glaucoma in 5% in about 5 years and about 15% in 10 years. And there's also a high risk of progression in patients who have glaucoma with pseudoexfoliation compared to open-angle primary disease. The prevalence of blindness in this group is also significantly higher. So we know that the glaucoma with pseudoexfoliation is a slightly more challenging and aggressive disease. The coexistence of cataract and pseudoexfoliation doesn't surprise us because we know it's the age, advancing age, that increases the incidence of both. Or there are some studies which show that in eyes where there's pseudoexfoliation in one eye, the cataract density is usually more in that eye. But we are not very sure of any causal link present between the two yet. So what are the challenges that we have when we are dealing with these eyes, especially when you're trying to do the cataract surgery in them? We need to know that the corneal endothelium can also be not as healthy as normal eyes in these patients. the pupillary dilatation can be a challenge because of the accumulation of this material into the stroma. Their zonular instability often leads to subluxations of lens, or on the table while you are operating, zonular dialysis, which can again be a challenge to deal with. And often these situations can lead to posterior capsular rupture or vitreous loss either through the zonular dialysis or the PCR. Not only is the challenge on the table, but we need to remember that the process continues to linger thereafter, and you can continue to have capsular contractions leading to zonular dialysis and subluxation of the intraocular lens that you've implanted in the back. So these patients need to be followed up on long-term basis. The inflammation is also relatively higher in eyes with pseudoexfoliation, and in the early post-operative period, you can find spike in these eyes if you are only doing cataract surgery. What are we going to choose? I think there's been a decent amount of discussion in the previous talks as to what to choose, what type of surgery to choose in patients who have cataract and glaucoma coexisting. And I think it depends upon, as we saw, severity of the disease, that is glaucoma, how much optic neuropathy is there, how well is it controlled on medications, what is the status of the cataract, and I think most of us will agree over here that in pseudoexfoliation we often try and deal with the cataract slightly earlier than otherwise, because we know that the challenges involved in the surgery are there, and sometimes if the lens is not as hard, it's easier to get away without complications. It's also important to look at any coexistent complications already present, like some amount of zonular dialysis or something. And it's extremely important to look at the angle. And while talking about it, that we know in the literature it's always labeled as the secondary open angle glaucoma. But when you look at them, a subtle subluxation or an anterior movement of the lens can often cause an added angle closure component in these eyes. And these are the eyes then where you might err, or you might want to deal with the cataract a little earlier than later. And status of the other eye. The patient has pseudoexfoliation in both eyes, looking at how the other eye behaved with surgery. Sometimes the choice of the surgery in the other eye might differ. What are the other preoperative considerations that you must look at more carefully in these eyes than routine other primary open angle eyes? You must look at the corneal endothelium, and if required, a specular microscopy should be done. And you can plan using a cohesive viscoelastic to try and cover the endothelium during the surgery. The anterior chamber depth is extremely important, not only for you to maintain the chamber well during surgery, but also get subtle clues that there might be a pre-existing subluxation existing. The angles must be assessed with gonioscopy, and you often will find the angle closure component also in these eyes. Pupil dilation should be checked in the OPD and noted on your charts so that you prepare yourself pre-operatively as to what are you going to use in these patients to help yourselves. And also assess for zonular weakness if there's any present pre-operatively. The cataract density should be given enough attention so that you plan your surgery well. The intraocular pressure and glaucoma status, of course, need to be looked at. As you see in the picture, it's not very often that you see this very advanced subluxation or obvious one, but very subtle one as you see in the top photograph. So you have to really look for it. So to choose between cataract surgery alone or combining the two, or trabeculectomy followed by cataract surgery, I think the dictum stays the same. But in pseudoexfoliative eyes, the glaucoma is often more advanced and more progressive. So combining the two is sometimes more oftenly seen with doing the cataract surgery alone. Intraoperatively, what is it that you're going to prepare yourself with? Very often people like to use preoperative non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, but they don't tend to help so much in these eyes. Discomidriasis, using high molecular weight OVD, sometimes can help you attain a little more dilation than you saw in the OPD. Pupil stretching devices and expanding devices like iris hooks or having rings in your operation theatre can be of great help. Over the years, I have moved away from the iris hooks and I'm using more and more expanders, and I'll show you the videos. Primarily because I feel in these eyes which have glaucoma, the lesser you manipulate the tissue for future, it's better. And with the iris hooks and all, sometimes the extra incisions and all are a challenge, and also tempting the iris towards the bone when you're doing the phacoemulsification sometimes makes it further difficult. So these are some of the things I think it's nice to have in your OT routine basis when you're dealing with this patient, so that if required, you already have things handy like the iris hooks, the expanders like the Maliban ring or the Oasis pupil expander, which are easily available in Indian market now, and the capsular tension ring, because even in subtle subluxations, if you put this ring, the stability later on for your lens and all is better guaranteed. A high molecular or viscoelastic in your OT can be a great help, and a vitrectomy cutter should be handy, and in some situation if you have a VR surgeon as a standby, even better. Some basic considerations before I show you quick videos is that the CCC must be of adequate size in these patients, and you must stress minimally during hydroresection and rotation. And I think I'll just take you through this video, which just shows that a simple stretching of the pupil sometimes can give you enough pupil dilation to proceed with phacoemulsification, especially if your cataract is not very hard. You can use any two instruments, either two VY rotators or Kuglin hooks, and just engage the pupillary edge and stretches, which causes actually small sphincter tears, very small ones, which allow you to proceed using a high molecular viscoelastic to complete your phacoemulsification, in which you try and stay within the central part of your pupil and try and do a vertical or a horizontal shot with minimal stress to the zonules. In this video, I am just showing the use of a Maliban ring, which allows you to expand your pupil during the surgery. If you're doing a combined, I always do my combined as two site, so your phacoemulsification doesn't become any different. So it comes loaded in a preloaded. All you have to do is pull the plunger, and the ring actually folds in itself. In the eye, when you're implanting it, the first the roll it's very easy to engage into the pupillary edge. Sometimes the other two, which is these two lateral ones, get engaged at the same time, and if they do not, you don't have to worry, because you can use the dialer to engage it into the pupillary edge thereafter. The rings come in various sizes ranging from 6 to 7.5. A very large ring sometimes becomes difficult to deal with, and I don't usually use them beyond 6.5mm size, and 6.5mm size gives you adequate dilation, and there is no floppy iris and all, and it keeps the pupillary edge retained back. So doing a phacoemulsification becomes far easier as compared to hooks and all, as it doesn't really interfere with your phaco tip or other instruments. After putting this ring inside, the phacoemulsification is routine. But in pseudoexfoliation eyes, it's important as well. I was showing the previous slide that you maintain minimal stress at all. We know that subluxations, even if not present preoperatively, can be caused during the procedure as well. So staying within the center and chopping more than separating can be of help. And also when you're trying to do IE in these patients, the tangential stripping is something that we like to do more than the centripetal, so that you stress the equator of the bag a little less. So the phacoemulsification is the routine. I just wanted you to show how easy it is to just remove this ring from the eye. All you have to do is put viscoelastic into the eye, engage the corner which is closer to your injection. I like to use 3-piece lenses in eyes with pseudoexfoliation, or a single-piece acrylic lens. Sometimes the stability of the bag I find is far better if I use a 3-piece acrylic lens, but that can of course be preference can be different as well. But plate haptics and all is something that I don't like to use in these eyes. So after implanting the lens and all, you just have to disengage the trailing corner, and once you've done that, you take the injector back in. So here that you just disengage it, you take the injector in, and you have to just put that loop in your injector and pull it back. But you stay within the eye. When you are folding it back, at least get the thing become almost linear. Once you reach that stage, it's easy to pull it out of the eye. So the pupil, as you can see, comes back to its normal position and doesn't go. This is another expander which I've just recently started using, the Oasis expander. The only trick here is when you're loading it, you do not pull it inside the plunger, but you just pull it back straight first and let it fold on itself, and then you pull the plunger back so that it gets loaded into the cartridge. And once you do it, the difference in this ring is that this gets implanted or injected into the anterior chamber primarily, and you cannot engage the pupillary edge while you are implanting it. Once you lay it in the anterior chamber, this is all under high molecular weight viscoelastic, then you can use the 4 edges with a dialer and engage the pupillary margin. I'll just show you how it's engaged, and I think I should be done. I have just 5 more seconds, it should suffice. So having launched it into the anterior chamber, and these are very, very pliable and flexible rings, so it's very easy to, and then just retract it to the dialer and engage it at the pupillary edge. And this gives you a very nice pupillary dilation throughout the procedure. And if you're doing any coexisting glaucoma surgery, you do these steps only after initiating your trabeculectomy flap, do your phacoemulsification with these rings, and thereafter remove it and go back to your trabeculectomy to finish it. So this is just to show how this gets engaged into the pupillary edge. And even removal is simple. For removal, you just disengage it and go back to the plunger, and these are so malleable that all you have to do is pull it out straight and the fold on itself and come out of the eye. So as you can see, you get a very decent about 7 millimeter dilation of the pupil after you implant these rings at the pupillary edges. So surgically, the management of the cataract becomes far easier. So this is how it looks. So just to conclude that the success of surgery depends on, of course, careful preoperative planning in these patients and having some specialized adjuncts available which can make your surgery easy and more predictable. And also what's most important is that you need to follow up these patients very carefully. It's not just doing the surgery, but being very careful in monitoring that how their glaucoma is doing, and even continue monitoring their IOL position in the eye, because often they can subluxate or have other capsular fibrosis changes causing visual changes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reena, for a nice presentation. Now I'll request Dr. Sridhar Rao to sum up the course, and then we take all the questions, and we will be outside the hall. So any one of you have questions, once the time is also over, we are going to be available to you. So,
Anybody has any questions?
For Dr. Reena, that between the last set, Malurin ring and
The Oasis.
Which one do you prefer and why?
Actually, Malurin I'm using for the last almost 2.5 years, and OS is relatively new. I've just started using it in the last 5 months, and in fact I'm liking Oasis better.
Why?
So I like it better because it's very pliable, and in the eye, sometimes in Malurin ring I felt the challenge, but when you're releasing it, sometimes it causes a little iris trauma and bleeding and all, and if it's a large ring, and once you snap the angle, it goes back and hits the anterior chamber angle sometimes. This is very large. So I'm finding that the Oasis ring, which I've only used now, about 9 of them, I find them far more easily used within the eye. So
I thought this works damages the angle than the Malurin.
it doesn't, because it's a square thing, and even when you're launching it in the eye, the stress in the eye is far lesser.
Cost-wise, they are saying.
Sorry? Cost-wise, Oasis right now, when we got it, was more like a sample to us. They hadn't launched it, but I think the cost is pretty similar.
Marketed by?
We are getting it from Chhatrapur, our distributor, but Oasis is an independent firm which launched it, I think, just about 6 to 8 months ago. I think in the last year, it was about a year ago, and now they are marketing through distributors. But we got actually a pack of few, and we were just playing with them, and now maybe we'll start using it. And in fact, I'm liking it a little more than the Malurin.
What's the cost of that?
See, Malurin turns out to be about 6,000 rupees to the patient. To the organization.
Reena, can you use the mic, please, because everybody can't hear you.
Sorry. I'm saying the Malurin costs the patient about 6,000 rupees, but to the organization, I think it's a little less, 4,000 or 3,000. I might be wrong. I am not sure. Maybe they have started making some, but we primarily use these.
So were initially so expensive and now they've come up and shown.
Yeah, initially actually because I am from an organization which does a lot of charitable work, so we were even ETOing them for our charitable wing. But the catch is sometimes if you haven't washed them enough before you load it back into the cartridge, if there's any viscoelastic remaining on them, it tends to fix these rings in the cartridge and you can't take them out the second time. But if you're very meticulous in washing them well and then putting it back into that triangular, the plastic case and then ETO it, it works well for almost 3-4 uses. We've done it for our charitable wing. Not something that I mean to say advocate otherwise routinely, but in patients where you want to give them the benefit without charging them, you might waste 2, but you'll be able to use the 3rd one on them. But it works well. Actually, it looks scary once you start using them. You find them far more, what shall I say, you wouldn't touch hooks thereafter. You wouldn't want to touch hooks thereafter. I will put it back.
Thank you, Dr. Reena. I would like to thank Dr. Madhu Baduria for asking me to summarize the course. I think all the aspects of the combined glaucoma and cataract surgery has been well covered. I think I would like to add a few things. One is that whenever you do a combined surgery, whether it's a single side phaco or a two side phaco, it's important to remember that normally when you do a simple trabeculectomy, we can do some things in the post-operative period like digital massage, all that. No? That can be a little dicey if you do a combined procedure, because when you do a digital massage in a patient who has had an IOL and trab, what happens, there is a risk of hyphema and the risk of showering of the chamber can occur. So that must be kept in mind. That's why if you want to get a really good intraocular pressure control, maybe doing a trab alone or IOL alone, and doing trab either before or after surgery, IOL is probably a better idea. Because now with the advent of temporal clear corner phaco, the eye is almost like a normal phakic eye. So doing a second stage trabeculectomy also not be a bad idea, because the virgin peninsula is open and the surgical success rate is as good as a primary trabeculectomy. The other thing you should keep in mind is that with the awareness that a lot of our patients have narrow angle glaucoma, doing a combined surgery can have all the complications which you see with the primary angle closure glaucoma and trabeculectomy, like a malignant glaucoma. So whereas a IOL alone, maybe the risk of malignant glaucoma will be less. So that should be kept in mind whenever you do plan a surgery. So supposing if you have a doubt, do a cataract surgery alone and do a trabeculectomy or control medically the intraocular pressure. But in case the patient has got very severe glaucoma where the pressure is like 30 or 40 with multiple drugs, doing a combined surgery may not be a good idea, because the combined surgery doesn't control the pressure as well as a simple trabeculectomy. Maybe controlling the pressure with trabeculectomy and do a temporal corneal phaco may be a good idea. I think there were some points which are mentioned on how to raise a flap where you get a uniform bed of the scleral flap, because the key to having a good trabeculectomy is to have a very good flap of the trabeculectomy. So one of the tips I would like to share with you is to use a 500 micron blade, which is a preset depth. If you make the marking with the blade, you get a uniform depth of flap, because otherwise what happens, with the number of traps being less, people find it difficult, especially the residents find it difficult to raise the flap. So sometimes the flap is too thin or it's too thick and they enter the antechamber too early. So one of the ways to avoid is to mark the flap with the 500 micron blade, because it's a preset depth is there, so that you get a uniform depth of the flap. I think regarding the pupil dilation has been very well covered using the hooks and all those new gadgets to expand the pupil, made the life much easier. And Dr. Madhu has mentioned about a combined armored valve and phaco. As he mentioned, that those are reserved for patients with severe glaucoma, like where there is PAS or in neovascular glaucoma. Maybe doing a trap may not be a good idea. Doing an armored valve may be a good idea. I think that's all I want to say, and I'd like to hand over to Dr. Madhu.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, audience. I think Dr. Dogra is already waiting for, not for this now. The next 4 people are here. If they're here, please be vacated and we'll be outside. The next 4 people are there. We can take the questions if nobody is here. We can stay here only. We leave the stage. We are here in the hall, and we take the questions right here. We are here for any questions. Anyone have any questions? Actually, we will take both of the version that on the table, we try to reduce it. If it is releasing on the table, we use afterwards also. If it is not releasing, we use the number of floors. Yes, at times. With 4 to that doesn't release. In that also there's sometimes phenol stuck in that. You must make sure that there is no phenol in that tissue. If there is any phenol, yeah. I don't think so. अब आएगा कहाँ? कौन देगा?
Morning, ma'am.
From next year, we will be Lucknow University. Then it will be probably better managed. I'm just totally, this is my first year in taking all this responsibility.
Sir, you got the award for excellence across Canada.
Thank you, sir. The same Thank you, sir. The hospital got it, sir.
हमारे लिए तो आप ही sir.
Yeah, you deserve it. Just change the face and transform it.
It's changed so much, yeah.
So, sorry about a little mix-up of the halls, and of course the timings that we've got to be all leaving. So, well, it's some of us are the unfortunate ones, and I always consider myself as one of them. So, I hope you get a useful, you have a useful interactive discussion besides the presentations, and whoever is here would gain a little bit definitely from this. So this is to simplify macular surgery, because macular surgery is an inherent part of all retinal surgeries, and many diseases of the macula can probably after surgery give the patient very useful vision, and that's what we got to understand, how to proceed with these procedures, with these techniques and the various techniques for these diseases of the retina of the macula which require surgery. So we just try to highlight a little bit, because possibly in this 1 or 20 minutes we can't possibly go into the details, but we'll just start with macular imaging because we don't have so much time left. And we'll have Dr. Sunita Roy, who's a senior resident registrar at the RP Center of Ophthalmic Sciences, to first speak on this. I'll request all the panelists to please come on the dais so that we could have 1 or 2 questions. As they'll be also the panelists, we'll have a little interactive in this to make it more lively. I request Dr. Dokra, Dr. Manish Nagpal. Ajay is just coming. I told him Hall E, so he's rushing from the F to E, but now. So he's just got to find E and come.
Insight into the macular imaging. Starting with fundus fluorescent angiography, as we all know, abnormal fluorescence can be hyperfluorescence, which could be leakage or a staining or pooling, or it could also be hypofluorescence, which can be blood fluorescence or capillary non-perfusion areas. Let us see some examples. In diabetic macular edema on fundus fluorescent angiography, we can either get a diffuse DME, which corresponds to a diffuse blood-retinal barrier damage, or we can get a focal DME, where we can see a bunch of microaneurysm in the clinical picture corresponding to the focal leaks. Macular ischemia can be seen as the distortion of the FAS or an enlargement of the FAS. In CNVM, in classic CNVM, we can see early hyperfluorescence due to early leakage, followed by a pooling. In occult CNVM, especially in the fibrovascular PD type, we can see the classical stippled appearance. Central serous chorioretinopathy can present as 2 classical pictures. One is the smokestack appearance, which is seen in 20% of the cases, and the other one is more common one is the in-block appearance. In pseudophakic cystoid macular edema, we can see a typical petaloid appearance in the mid and the late venous phase. Coming to autofluorescence imaging, it is a topographic mapping of the lipofuscin pigments in the retinal pigment epithelium, with the most dominant fluorophore is A2E fluorophore. There are many techniques of fundus autofluorescence imaging, like the fundus spectrophotometer, the scanning laser ophthalmoscope, or the fundus camera. The advantage of scanning laser ophthalmoscope being it has a confocal mechanism, so it actually avoids the interference from the interference of the autofluorescence coming from the lens and the other structures of the eye. Autofluorescence imaging helps us in the early diagnosis of the disease. It helps us to document the progression of the geographical atrophy. In heredomacular degeneration, it helps in the diagnosis. It also delineates more extensive areas of damage in macular dystrophies rather than the fluorescein angiography. Thus, the advantages of autofluorescence imaging being detection of the early disease and phenotyping. It acts as a predictive marker for the disease. It helps in the monitoring of the disease progression, for the functional correlation with the disease, and it can also help. It can also be used as a future therapeutic applications. Indocyanine green angiography helps in the diagnosis of the choroidal vascular lesions. Its physical characteristics allows visualization through overlying melanin, xanthophyll pigments, and serosanguinous fluid. It doesn't have too many applications nowadays, but in polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy, it is a very important investigation where we can see polyps at the level of the macula. In CNVM, we can see the hotspots. This was more important in the pre-anti-VEGF era, where laser was the main modality of treatment. There are many multimodality imaging systems like the Spectralis system, which has advantages like the new proprietary tracking technology, which decreases the amount of artifact, axial resolution being 3.5 micron, and it is much more faster. Above all, it has an enhanced depth imaging, which helps us to image the choroid in a much detailed way, and it also records simultaneously the fundus fluorescein angiography, ICG, OCT, infrared and blue reflectance images. Thus, we can map out the area on the retina properly. Optical coherence tomography, as we all know that it is based on partial coherence interferometry principle. It gives us a detailed view of all the layers of the retina, like the vitreoretinal interface, nerve fiber layer, outer plexiform layer, ELM, ISOS junction, retinal pigment epithelium, and the choroid. It gives us a qualitative and a quantitative analysis of the macula. It gives us a very detailed picture of different types of vitreomacular interface disturbances, like vitreomacular traction, epiretinal membrane, or macular hole. In macular hole, we can also measure the different parameters by which we can actually calculate the indices of macular hole, and we can prognosticate the patient. We can also use this OCT for follow-up. Like here, we can see that there is a return of the foveal contour. The ELM is continuous, but the ISOS junction is still not continuous. In this patient, after 3 months of follow-up after macular hole surgery, still there is a discontinuity in the ISOS and the ELM layer. In age-related macular dystrophy, it helps in the diagnosis and the follow-up. It helps us to confirm the diagnosis, to look for any geographic atrophy, and to follow up the CNVM patients. Like in this patient, in the first patient, after 3 injections of ranibizumab, there is a partial resolution of the fluid. But in the second patient, after the 3 injections of ranibizumab, there is a complete resolution of the fluid. Geographic atrophy can be seen as foveal thinning. In diabetic retinopathy, it helps us to confirm the diagnosis of diabetic macular edema. It helps us to classify the diabetic macular edema, quantify the macular edema, and follow up the patient after anti-VEGF or laser therapy. It also helps us to look for any disturbance in the vitreomacular interfaces. Like in this slide, we can see spongiform edema, cystoid macular edema, neurosensory detachment, and a vitreomacular interface disturbance like an ERM. Here we can see 2 types of vitreomacular interface, like a thick-top posterior hyaloid and an ERM. In central serous chorioretinopathy, we can either see a neurosensory detachment or a neurosensory detachment with a serous PED, that is the type 2 type of CSR. Just an example, in an optic disc pit with maculopathy, if you take a cut through the optic disc, then we can see the optic disc pit here. Along with it, we can also see a maculocytosis and a neurosensory detachment. We can also see, in some cases, an outer retinal hole. Multifocal electroretinogram. As we can see here, the first wave is a negative wave, and then the second wave is a positive wave. The latency is measured from the time of stimulus to the peak of the P1, and the amplitude is measured from the trough of the N1 to peak of P1. It has many images, but the important being the trace arrays and the 3D response density plots, and the trace arrays at different field like 5 degree, 10 degree, 15 degree, like that. Just 2 examples. In age-related macular dystrophy, here we can see a dip of sensitivity at the macular region. In retinitis pigmentosa, there is a global decrease in the sensitivity. This is a patient who has been treated with stem cell therapy in a case of RP, and here we can see that at 6 months of follow-up, the sensitivity is a little bit better than the control patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. We have a question for the panel. Dr. Dogra, what would you think is how would you compare a confocal scanning laser ophthalmoscope system with the standard spectral domain OCT FFA systems like the ZEISS or some other TopCon, which are those non-confocal systems? So how do you compare these systems versus the confocal SLOs? Some people have to go in for a combined system. Should they go in for a combined system, and what are the advantages or the disadvantages, pros and cons?
I think if we look at what we call these days sort of a multimodal imaging, which has definitely got a lot of role in so many situations. If we are looking for that, then we do have systems where we can do simultaneous ICG, FFA. We can have an OCT as well as a point-to-point, especially during follow-up. It is very important that you can just go to the same area, and not only that, probably you would get also better autofluorescence images. So I think there are advantages and if we just have a spectral domain, sort of most of these OCTs may not have all these incorporated there, especially from that point of view. Otherwise, practically speaking, even any system would do most of the things what we want. If we are just looking at optical coherence tomography, obviously both are different as far as the confocal and others is concerned. Even their interpretation is also a little different, and especially if we look at autofluorescence images.
So it's better maybe in a way that's higher resolution, or
yes, confocal systems, many of them, they have a higher resolution and would give better, because all these newer things like autofluorescence especially, I think since it has got a lot of role, and during follow-up, even all these cases where we are these days giving a lot of pharmacotherapy, I think it does help to give us better images.
Manish? Yeah. Yes, Ajay. Can you give a mic, please?
I think I'm fairly audible. The only problem with most of the devices is when we talk of resolution, we forget about the lateral resolution. All these devices have a lateral resolution of 14 microns. The axial resolution has changed. The axial resolution has changed from say 10 to now almost about spectralis is about 2 microns, but the lateral resolution is remains same. So unless until we address that, I don't think
the standard spectral domain also has about 3 to 5.
It's 3 to 5, but the lateral resolution is 10 to 15.
10 to 15. But for the confocal system, like the spectralis, the axial is about 2, which is approximately the same as 3 to 5.
But the lateral remains same.
Lateral remains the same there also.
That's the problem.
Okay, so Manish, what would you be using a confocal SLO?
Yeah, I mean, if in an ideal situation, the multimodal is the best, the spectralis, which offers you, it's like FA, ICG, autofluorescence, and OCT. The four most important ones that we would use for, suppose there's a macular pathology and you've done an FA or an ICG or an OCT singly, and you see whatever is the data. If you have some lesion on an FA, like a polyp or a leak or a suspicious, at the same time you can just switch to the OCT and pass it through exactly the same point, which is not possible with any other system. You'll have to shift the patient, and then there's no way you are sure that is it moving in the same place or not. So here, that ability to do and pinpoint the lesion by anatomical as well as functional mode. If you have an FA, you have an OCT passing through exactly the same point, gives you a lot more information. So ideally, yes, that would be the best way to look at it.
Hello, could I ask a question, please?
Yes, please.
I'm going by what Manish said. Why is pure OCT machine or FFA machine more popular than HRA? Because most of the hospitals are.
Well, I think it's a practical issues. There's cost involved and a lot of other issues. That's why. So there's nothing wrong with having an OCT separate. Of course, you'll get your information, but this gives you an additional way to look at a patient, and especially in cases where you have a dilemma or you're not sure what kind of a lesion you're dealing with. In classic cases, I don't think there's any issue. If a macular hole is there and you have an OCT, that's all you need. You don't need an FA or an ICG or anything else for that matter. But if you have some kind of a leaking pathology and you're not sure what you're dealing with, IPCVs and other things, I think there it's tremendously useful for us to see a pinpoint location, how you see on the OCT, how you see on the autofluorescence, how you see on the FA, how you see on the ICG. All these together give you a lot more information.
I think that's my question, because HRA seems to be...
It's just the cost, because nobody questions the gold standard which Spectralis gives you in total.
Thanks. Thank you.
So MIBS systems, sorry about that. So macular hole surgery, it's also a minimally invasive vitreous surgery. That's what the concept is now, for excepting for a few cases where you might do an hybrid vitrectomy, where you have to remove a foreign body, or if you've got a choroidal detachment with a retinal detachment, you want to 6 mm cannula. In fact, I'd like to ask the panelists and the audience about 6 mm cannulas in these 23 and 25 gauge systems, because there I use a 20 gauge 6 mm cannula, and so that's a hybrid system. So the advantages are immense, and I think you all know that the scarring is less, the surgical astigmatism is much less, and we've got a duty cycle control in most of the newer vitrectomy machines, which you must be all aware of and must be using. That's the port is actually closed most of the time whenever you're shaving across the retina, so that's an advantage. And it also there's a fluidic stability which is there, so IOP is well maintained, and there's less traction to the retina as you're moving along the surface, as you just mentioned, so less break formation. So you can use 23, 25 and now the 27 gauge, about which we'll have some questions also. And surgery, successful closure could be because of the induced glasses by the surgical trauma of peeling the ILM, which is not thought to be part of the macular hole surgery, that you should peel the ILM. Various studies initially said that you may or may not. Maybe for tiny holes, stage 2 holes you may not, but for stage 3, 4 or large flat holes you may like to definitely peel the ILM, because the surgical results are much better and subsequently visual results could improve. Brilliant Blue G is now a very highly non-toxic dye as compared to the previously used indocyanine green and even the trypan blue dye, which stained the ILM very faintly, and we used to use triamcinolone crystals also. So one of our studies at the Graphite showed that the Brilliant Blue G is a relatively non-toxic dye. It's injected under fluid, so not under air like trypan blue, and it's less toxic to the photoreceptor RP layer has been shown in various experimental studies with ICG. ICG is thought to be very phototoxic dye. It stays in the eye for nearly 6 months to 1 year after injecting into the eye. So though it stains the ILM very well, it is the phototoxic. Brilliant Blue G basically takes over from that, and a short video will just tell you a few steps about this biplanar incision which we make with the 23-25 gauge systems. We'll ask our panelists what they feel about the newer system of 27 gauge and whether this biplanar incision would be of any role or not. But the biplanar incision basically ensures there is a pressure closure of the valvular entry, and so there is no fluid egress or any chance of any infection going in or the hypotony subsequently, and also to make sure that there is no choroidals coming up the next day. So, and this is just the ILM which is stained with Brilliant Blue G under fluid, and within a minute or two the stain is enough for you to go ahead and peel, and probably to peel across a hole you remove the traction at the edge of the hole. Any traction or traction ring sometimes we see. So this is just to show you the procedure, and we'll go on further. We did some electron microscopic study to show that the ILM removal plays a major role in the closure of a macular hole. This is an electron microscopic study predominantly using, that time we were using ICG in 2005, and this is one of the fibrocytes. Yeah, pointer. This show fibrocyte within the ILM, excised ILM in electron microscopy, which we had also recorded. So, low macular hole index holes are large flat holes. So, the standard to stage 2, 3, 4 holes may be having a high, maybe higher in height and small base diameter, so they are usually easy to close. But what happens if the height upon the base diameter divided by the base diameter is called the macular hole index? That's the B upon A. This is the B, the height upon the A is, if it's more than 0.5, the results are extremely encouraging. Less than 0.5 is what we say is a larger diameter or large holes. So there we've also done some cases, and this is just to show you, this is in the evolution that the macular hole forms because of the vitreomacular traction. And you can have type 1 or type 2 closure. Type 1 closure, there is no defect of the neurosensory retina. That's a complete closure. Type 2, there is a defect in the center, but the edges are flat. They're absolutely flat down. There's no gap between the retinal edge and the macular hole edge and the underlying RPE. So it's a flat down hole, but there's a gap in the center is in type 2 closure. The visual acuity results automatically are much lesser. But type 1 can be U pattern or a V pattern, depending on the type of pattern you see. So the lines are very important. So OCT plays a major role, and the ISOS line and the ELM are extremely important. You must be all knowing about those lines, and they say the continuity of those lines post-operatively helps you to give a possible indicator the patient's going to improve visual acuity. Especially the ELM now they say is very important. The ELM runs through the photoreceptor cell body. So the photoreceptor integrity becomes normal after macular hole surgery, and they say that the visual acuity improves. So you have to study these lines on the OCT. That's why these imaging modalities are very important. What we just discussed. These are large flat old hole. So just do a little tapping on the edges of the hole. We presented this at the Asia Pacific meeting at Hong Kong, and subsequently published this data. This is to increase the height of the hole. This is after Peter Starmans from Belgium, who has adopted this technique, and he just taps the edge of the hole without trying not to touch the RP. So it's to increase the intraoperative height. The intraoperative OCT would play a major role in such cases to know what happens. Intraoperative OCT would also be a point which we'd just like to see and discuss. So this is just to tell you about the last slide is for to tell you that positioning nowadays is not thought to be 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Patient gets discomforted when the surgeon tells him it's going to make you prone for 1 to 4 weeks, and then he's going to start thinking that should I get the whole surgery or not. So actually the hole closure, as described by Klaus Eckhart, who is one of the pioneering surgeons for macular hole surgery, and he's described it, and his Frankfurt Retina meetings are extremely well attended from India also. He said the hole, if it has to close, would close in the first 3 days. And that's what I personally noticed also. So if you've got to give the positioning, the first 3 to 5 days, maximum 3 days in the first 3 days strict positioning, actually plays a major role in the whole project. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions for the panelists. I'd like to ask, it's very small. Does he feel that the evolution of microincision vitreous surgery 23, 25, can we go to 27 also for doing most of the surgery, sir, or should we stick to 25, 23? What would be your opinions?
I think, although I have no personal experience, Manish is here, he has some experience with 27. I have no experience with 27. But what has happened over a period of time, especially for a surgery like macular hole, many a times we do 25 gauge. Because quickly you can finish everything, you don't need much of this thing, and I think many of our cases these days even have shifted probably from 23 to 25 as far as the macular hole surgery is concerned. So 25, although they are similar, it doesn't matter. It does not matter if it is 23 or 25 most of the time, because in a surgery like macular hole, because you quickly come out, so most of the time you will not have leaky areas, other stuff. Which happens, of course, in a very complicated diabetics, others, attachments, we do PVRs, because there we are entering so many times, so that's what I feel. So
maybe 23, 25 are ideal. Ajay, what do you feel? Is there a law of diminishing returns which starts playing up when you go very small? I mean, what would you think the future would be? The future in India as regards small incision surgery?
I think when we go on to a higher gauge, like 27 or maybe even 30 gauge, we probably may not be doing an entire vitrectomy. We might end up doing a localized cortex removal of the vitreous, treat the macular hole, and then we really do not understand what happens to this collagen fibrils within the vitreous, how does it collapse, what happens to the recurrence of epiretinal membranes. So, that only will show up after a few months or years. So I personally think if I can get in and have a closed wound, a sclerotomy which is non-leaking, and I can get that job done with 23 or 25, why go on to 27, especially in developing world?
I mean, peripheral vitreous removal would be...
Sorry?
Peripheral vitreous removal.
One is the flexibility of the instruments. So like Alcon has done with the Edge Plus, where you have some stability posteriorly, something similar.
They've got that sleeve, stiffening sleeve.
Stiffening sleeve which is there behind. So that would help in the instruments not, but still with the 27 gauge, removing the entire Whitcase would not be suitable.
So Manish, what would be, you have done this surgery? I think you worked and you've been in close collaboration with Dr. Oshima.
Yeah. So we've used some prototypes for the 27 gauge, but don't regularly use it. But as of now, if you ask me, the best thing of 27 is the wound construction, because it's so small that when you make it at the end of surgery, you don't see it at all. But if you ask me about the intraoperative experience, I think as of now, I would like to use 25. Because 27, as Ajay also said, except for a patient, who has some floaters and you are just clearing those. We did a few cases like that actually. And those.
You had an option to do 25, 27 in the macular hole or a ERMP.
You could, but I'm really not sure what would be the advantage of even using two separate sets of things where, you could either use a 27 or a 25, but to remove the Whitcase in the periphery because of the bending of instruments and other things is a problem.
Surgeons from Japan strongly advocate 27 gauge.
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of people who are comfortable with 27, but personally I would prefer 25 as of now. But then we used to feel the same when 25 had originally come, and we used to prefer 23, but now they've improved the instruments, so maybe as it advances and if it gets better, maybe 27 would be.
Can I add a point here?
Yeah, sure.
So the thing is, all of us talk about 23, 25, 27. We did some studies on measuring the cannulas with a micrometer with a specificity at 0.001 millimeters. And we found that the best cannulas, the best cannulas available in the market for 23 gauge are not actually 23 gauge. Their size is 0.72 millimeters.
You would devise your own cannula?
No, not my cannula. See, because a needle, which is a trocar, is 23 gauge, is 0.6. So the entry point is 0.6, but the cannula is not 0.6. The cannula is 0.72. But the 25 gauge is 0.5 is the entry point. The cannula is 0.62.
It's a little larger.
So it's larger. So for the non-macular surgery, as Dr. Mangat said, where you are going to be spending a little bit more time, there's a lot of stretching. The scleral rigidity comes in here. So the sclera doesn't respond as well as what a corneal wound would respond. So therefore, there is a lot of issues which have to be addressed. Therefore, maybe 27 gauge might be useful, but then we are not doing a complete job.
Okay, so there is a future, but we don't know yet. We still say 25, we take the final key, this thing is that the message we give is that 25, 23 are still the surgery, microincision surgery of choice.
Yeah, if the wound closes, I think I'll be happy with 23.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll have the next talk on, we can have some question after this talk. But Ajay Arora will be talking about vitreomacular traction, very important topic, about the role of surgery in India and the role of, especially, we'd like to hear about the role of ochriplasmin as regards our subcontinent.